everybody in the region, all of our Gulf allies, and the two countries where these individuals would be housed, if you would, under this plan. So Egypt and Jordan summarily dismissed and opposed the plan. It would cause, I think, from their perspective, a lot of instability in their country. There's no infrastructure for them, of course. So you take all of those three together, and I think they saw a almost immediate backlash, not just from who you'd expect, Democrats, for example, in the United States, but also Republican allies in the Senate and House. And I think that kind of took them a little bit to kind of get back on their feet. And then they came out with rolling back many of the ideas that President Trump put out there.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. This time we're joined by former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Mick Mulroy. Mick is also a retired CIA paramilitary operations officer. He spent years as both a commissioned and enlisted Marine. After leaving the Pentagon, he co-founded the Lobo Institute, which brings together veterans and the international community for humanitarian operations. Mick, welcome.
Great to be with you, Louis.
Mick, what did you make of Trump's plans for the US to own Gaza and rebuild it into the Riviera of the Middle East?
So I think starting with, it came out, I think, as a surprise to many in his own government, including in the White House, potentially even the National Security Advisor. At least that was what it looked like to me, certainly in the Pentagon and the State Department. But to go through the plan, I would say in its total, and we'll get to the fact that it's been walked back substantially. In its total, it was both highly impractical. I mean, we're talking 2 million people in Gaza who do not want to leave their homeland, heavily armed. It would be a substantial and very complicated military endeavor that would likely require many more forces, potentially even U.S. forces. So that, of course, would be inconsistent with what President Trump said during his campaign, which is to disentangle U.S. forces from conflicts, especially in the Middle East. So that's the first part. The second part, I'd say it's, I'm not an international legal scholar, but it does appear to me to be unlawful. You cannot forcibly displace a population from their homeland. That is against international humanitarian laws. So there's that. And then, of course, the third is it had no support, in fact, the opposite of support from everybody in the region, all of our Gulf allies, and the two countries where these individuals would be housed, if you would, under this plan. So Egypt and Jordan summarily dismissed and opposed the plan. It would cause, I think, from their perspective, a lot of instability in their country. There's no infrastructure for them, of course. So you take all of those three together, and I think they saw a almost immediate backlash, not just from who you'd expect, Democrats, for example, in the United States, but also Republican allies in the Senate and House. And I think that kind of took them a little bit to kind of get back on their feet. And then they came out with rolling back many of the ideas that President Trump put out there, which included, going from permanent displacement, in President Trump's words, it was permanent, to temporary from the White House spokesperson, as an example. On the other side, like, why would he say something that would get so much negative reaction? Potentially some kind of negotiation tactic, I suppose, where he shocks the system, and then people start coming up with their own plans because that one's obviously not one that they would want. To the extent, I think that's a good thing, not necessarily saying these things, but getting more countries, particularly our Gulf partners, U.S. Gulf partners, and the U.K., of course, talking about an actual plan instead of just admiring the problem and tweeting about the issues. That does nobody any good, and it'll essentially keep this system in place, which could be a permanent cycle of violence. So if this spurs an actual conversation that leads to concrete ways ahead with the participation of all these significant partners in the United States in the Middle East, then I suppose that would be a good thing.
And, Trump had said that he had already gained support from some of these neighboring states, and that rich states in the region might be willing to chip in, as it were, monetarily to help with the rebuilding. Is there any sign that that was true? And you were mentioning the plans there. Has anyone else come forward with other plans?
So, of course, I don't know what's going on internally between the dialogue of the White House, Riyadh, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha. If those are the countries that President Trump's referring to, I think it's likely they will chip in, if you will, for the reconstruction of Gaza. It needs to happen. I've seen estimates over $50 billion to actually reconstruct in 10 to 15 years of time, of course. So that'll go well beyond the second Trump administration. But it needs to happen. It needs to be a diplomatic path forward, and that includes the reconstruction so they can actually have an economy, so they can sustain themselves and not be a perpetual state of need. So, and that really needs to come from the Gulf partners in the Middle East. We've seen the Trump administration essentially dismantle U.S. aid, USAID. Um, if they're not going to be participating, and I don't know what the final outcome of that will be, then there'll be a big need for humanitarian assistance around the world and the stepping up of a lot of different countries to make up for that. And especially when it comes to rebuilding Gaza, which will be extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily expensive.
And Trump's idea of resettling Gazans, is that remotely possible, even on a temporary basis?
So I don't think so, and I'll put it this way: I don't think that Egypt will want to temporarily house up to 2 million. I don't think they'll want to leave. So still, you'll have to force them out, which will essentially be a fight. And it's in there. You know, the IDF has depleted Hamas substantially, but that doesn't mean there isn't readily available small arms for even individual citizens to fight back if they felt that they were being forced out of their country, even if temporary. And now that the whole plan is out there, that it originally was permanent, I don't believe that there'll be any trust in trying to now convince them to leave temporarily and then they'll return. I think they'll believe that this is a permanent relocation, especially since this plan was laid out with the permanency being one of the primary factors in it.
And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, came out with Trump for this announcement at the press conference. But do you think the Israelis as a whole would back this plan?
So as a whole, that's a good question, Louis. From media reports, I don't know. They were even surprised by this plan. And I talked to a lot of my friends that are over in Israel. The immediate reaction was the concern that Hamas would just end the first phase of the ceasefire uh, agreement, because they would just see that the end game is not a withdrawal of IDF, a return of Gaza to Palestinians. The end game, if you listen to the plan, would be the complete expulsion of Palestinians, which of course include Hamas, out of Gaza. So why would they continue? I think because the White House was so quick in walking that back, that the ceasefire appears to have held, which is obviously a good thing. Still have to see if we can get into second phase. But I do think that it's important to note that it has been walked back. So I think we're almost to a point where we're before the press conference with Israel. There's some in Israel that jumped on this immediately. Obviously, the far right, for example, and Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition government, and they probably want to see this. They're also talking about taking over the West Bank entirely, fully occupying it, potentially even expulsion of Palestinians from there. So this for that one section of the Israeli political sphere, which obviously doesn't represent all of it, is a good plan, and one they probably will keep trying to go back to now that it's out there.
Well, I think that's a really important point, actually, because as you say, Trump's team have since rode back quite significantly from those proposals. But even if those were just a sort of negotiating tactic, shock therapy by Trump, will that press conference have pretty much set the tone for Donald Trump's dealing with the partners in the Middle East region?
And that might be the exact audience he was intended. So if it was a shock factor, a shock and awe kind of negotiation tactic, it worked in the sense that it got everybody's attention. Everybody was, of course, opposed to it. But now I think the idea, if that was the strategy, is to go back and say, okay, what's your idea? Because if you don't like that idea, and most people don't, um, what's your plan? So it can't be just you guys figure it all out and we'll either approve or not approve at the end of it. If that's the plan, then we'll just continue on decades of negotiations with very little to show for it. I think we could all agree that that isn't the way we should go. We should have a comprehensive plan of which is funded so that both sides can see how this would actually be implemented, how Israel can be assured of its security, because they're never going to leave if Hamas has a chance of taking back over. No country would. I think we could all agree on that. No country would let the group that attacked them like they did on October 7th regain power in their neighboring country. But also, the Palestinians need a path that actually goes to their future, which is economic viability. Their children go to school. There is, of course, all the basics of necessity in society and food and water and health that they can actually sustain on their own. And that's really going to require a lot of investments. And I think that's one place in particular that the Trump administration might be good at when it comes to talking to the Saudis about why this investment would be good for the region long term.
I mean, certainly a lot more work to be done on long-term peace in the region. But in the immediate sense, we've seen the hostage handover continuing between Israel and Hamas. Are there signs that the ceasefire agreement will hold? And what impact could a less predictable White House have on that agreement?
So I think the biggest issue that we're facing right now, and I believe negotiations for the second phase are already underway, but the biggest issue comes down to security. Um, the IDF under the second phase has to withdraw from all population centers and withdraw from Gaza. If that doesn't happen, then they're not in the second phase of the ceasefire agreement. Right now, there's nobody to replace the IDF when it comes to security other than Hamas, who is, I think, potentially falsely, but trying to show an image that they are still fully intact. Um, I don't think they're fully intact. I think they've been depleted probably about by half, maybe two-thirds. But that's still a substantial fighting force that would likely take over and then recruit immediately from a very disgruntled population, and then essentially be back in charge of security in Gaza, and that's not acceptable again to the Israelis. So who's going to fill that gap? There's reports that the U.S. has gone around starting back the Biden administration, asking countries in the region whether they could put together a multinational force, and that was met with a resounding no. So I don't know what will happen with that, but that is one of the big issues that needs to be addressed in this, because it would seem to me if that can't be answered, then this ceasefire agreement may end at the first phase, and fighting may then, of course, restart.
And there was a time when it was largely seen that Netanyahu and Trump were not on great terms, but uh, this announcement and, of course, Trump's sanctions on the International Criminal Court suggest there's a far closer US Israel alliance emerging. What does that mean for the US?
So, of course, you have the relationship between the individual leaders, which is very important for sure. Um, President Trump, during his first administration, very pro-Israel, recognizing the Golan Heights as part of Israel, moving the embassy to Jerusalem. There's a lot. There's a lot that can really shore up the fact that the first Trump administration um, was very pro-Israel, and if you talk to Israelis, they believe that's the case. Then there was a rift, when it came to President Biden winning the presidency and Prime Minister Netanyahu being the first to congratulate him. Apparently, that created a personal rift. But I think it's important to point out that it's already pretty evident that the second Trump administration is very pro-Israel, like the first one. They're also putting individuals in place like former Governor Huckabee is likely to be the next ambassador, very pro-Israel. Elise Stefanik, who is going to, I think she was already confirmed to be the U.S. ambassador to the UN, has said very pro-Israel statements. In her confirmation, she didn't back down from any of her previous comments as a congressperson. So I think it's very clear that the incoming or now current administration and their team that's coming in, right? I don't think Ambassador Huckabee's been confirmed yet, or incoming Ambassador Huckabee's been confirmed yet. But I think their statements indicate that we can expect that the second Trump administration may be even more pro Israel than the first.
Well, I wanted to move on actually a little bit from Israel and speak about Iran. Of course, a long time target of Trump, really, and the Republicans. Trump has said this week he'd prefer a nuclear deal with Iran, but are Iran in a position that they would even be willing to come to the table with the Trump administration on this?
I think so. I think they'd be ripe for it. They've just seen multiple proxies of theirs, so forces that they support and oftentimes direct, Hezbollah, Hamas, and even the Houthis, take a beating. I mean, Hezbollah has been substantially depleted, Hamas as well. And of course, they lost their platform of operations in Syria with the fall of the Assad regime. And they have seen on the world stage that they are no match at all for Israel. So I think they feel isolated, they feel vulnerable, and now they have President Trump, who's very hawkish on Iran. But he's also the person who really wants to make peace deals. He made it clear that this is one of the main efforts of his administration. And I, of course, talk to a lot of the folks in his administration, and they repeat that often. So I think this is a right time for a agreement that hopefully includes our European partners as well. And Iran agrees to halt entirely their, what I think, efforts right now that are underway to get to a nuclear weapons capacity. If that can happen, and I would hope this was the biggest criticism of the first nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, address the issue of proxy forces. So it's more than just I agree, and from Iran's perspective, not to seek a nuclear weapon, but I also will not fund a rogue element to then attack other countries in the region. Because remember, it's not just Israel. They funded the Houthis who attacked Saudi Arabia and UAE. So they've been a very malign actor. If that can be addressed in this, and then, of course, what's in it for Iran? Sanctions relief. And I think that would be a big deal for the people of Iran. Obviously, I don't care about the regime in Iran, but the people of Iran could take sanctions relief and capitalize on it fully. It's a very modern, very intelligent society. It could really turn the tides for their economic future if this agreement was signed and sanctions were, of course, reduced or if not eliminated, as long as Iran kept up its side of the agreement.
Of course, it was Trump that withdrew from the original deal, nuclear deal in 2018. So it sounds like, from your perspective, he's quite likely to kind of realize his aim of getting a new deal with Iran then.
I think so. I think he would really like that. And I was in the Pentagon when we withdrew. The Pentagon was, for our side, was opposed to withdrawing, not because they agreed that it was a good agreement, but they just didn't see how that would do anything to help stem the proxy forces, which were not only attacking our partners in the region, but also U.S. forces, of course. So this was something, that's water under the bridge. We are where we are, but I do think now President Trump will want to see a lasting, comprehensive agreement with Iran. Again, there was fair criticism last time. It was so narrowly focused that Iran just shifted all their efforts into the proxy forces and causing mayhem in the region. If it includes both, then I think this would be a great agreement, not only for the United States and our partners in Europe, but particularly for the region, because the biggest destabilization of the region right now, by far, is Iran and has been for decades. If they could get back into the community of nations and start focusing on building a better future for the Iranian people, we would all be better off for it. Everybody in the region and the world.
Iran, having lost a lot of their proxies, there was talk that they would need to focus in a way on some other form of deterrent in the region. Do you think that they have, in the meantime, been spending more effort on their nuclear program?
I do. And that's another part that makes this agreement, if not the most important part, that makes this agreement essential. Most reports from agencies who would know, including the International Atomic Energy Agency, is that they are very close to having enough nuclear material to build 4 nuclear weapons. We're talking weeks if they broke out and got the enrichment level to a point where it's weaponized. Now, that doesn't mean they can launch a nuclear weapon. They have to actually create the mechanism. And I'm not a nuclear weapons expert, but I know enough about it from my time in the Pentagon. They have to create the mechanism that would start the reaction that makes the explosion. That could take a year. But if they get enough, unless they are, of course, supported by somebody who already has this ability, like Russia, like North Korea, we believe. So that could be expedited. But once that's available, then they're going to look at how to deliver it. They could do that in a very sophisticated way by, ballistic missiles, or they could do it in an unsophisticated way by putting it on a barge, for example. So this is a very real problem. Iran sees it can have in no way stand up militarily, conventionally to Israel, and Israel's already depleted most of their air and missile defense systems. So they're likely looking at this as a way to preserve the regime, since they're 100% worried about that over anything else. So we have a situation where Iran's likely going to a nuclear weapon. That makes the importance of these negotiations and getting to an agreement even more so. Of course, we're going to need to know and have the ability to verify whether they're not doing this, because they can have overt facilities that they point us to and then covert effort on the other side. So we need to have confidence in that. If not, I think as they get closer and closer to this, we could potentially see a strike on their nuclear facilities by Israel, or maybe even by Israel and the United States. But that's something that I think we could avoid if we, of course, get to this agreement that President Trump is potentially talking about.
Well, Mick, I think we've covered a lot of topics here, very comprehensive. But I wondered if there are any other areas in the Middle East that you think the Trump administration will be looking to next. Are there any other hotspots or areas where Trump has an agenda that he'd like to achieve?
So I would highlight Syria. Syria was an issue back in the first Trump administration for the Pentagon side. Not that I speak for them anymore, but they haven't changed, I don't believe. They believe the defeat of ISIS, of course, was a big success, not only for the United States and our international partners, about 80 countries involved, but for the people of Iraq and Syria primarily, right? They had essentially taken over and created their version of a caliphate. The enduring defeat of ISIS is still important. They have increased their attacks substantially. Part of what mitigates that is the U.S.'s involvement with what's called the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF. The leadership is largely Kurdish in the eastern part of Syria. If that comes to an end, that could challenge the ability to do this. That, I think, is something that the Trump administration, just like they did in the first Trump administration, is looking at whether they can withdraw U.S. forces. I believe there'll be voices within the Department of Defense and potentially the CIA that will just caution the president on that. We have our troops, very few of them, conducting mostly support, so not on the front lines, that really enable our partners there. But that's going to be something to look ahead and see. That's going to be probably a friction point in U.S. national policy going forward.
Well, Mick, it's been very informative. Thank you very much for joining us today on the Trump Report.
Thanks, Louis.